The Luftwaffe, so the German Air Force, was officially created in February of 1935 with Hermann Göring as its commander-in-chief. He had been a celebrated First World War fighter pilot and was one of Hitler's closest political associates. The Luftwaffe enjoyed a rapid expansion in its first 5 years, in large measure due to Göring's considerable political influence. In the Luftwaffe, the largest mobile and autonomous unit was the Geschwader. A Geschwader was the equivalent of a wing in the United States Army Air Forces. In a Kampfgeschwader, literally a combat wing or a medium bomber unit, the Heinkel 111 and the Junkers Ju-88 aircraft were the mainstay of the German bomber force until the end of the war. Before the war, the Luftwaffe bomber force was designed as a close support weapon, moving forward with ground troops, not as an instrument for a strategic bombing campaign against a determined opposing fighter force. As the war progressed, the Luftwaffe suffered various problems because of this fact, which hampered its effectiveness, for example, in the Battle of Britain. The backbone of the Kampfgeschwader were the experienced aces who were able to achieve results through individual professional actions and, at the same time, lead the inexperienced youth. The main reason for the effectiveness of the German bomber force during the war was its flexibility. The same crews could carry tactical missions and strategic raids in the deep rear at a distance of 1,000 kilometers. And at any moment, they could turn their bombers into transports, providing supplies for surrounded German troops. The standard crew of the Junkers Ju-88 consisted of 4: the pilot, the navigator, the wireless radio operator, and the flight mechanic. In the Heinkel, which had a more spacious cabin and more free space inside, the crew had a 5th member, a gunner as well. A Luftwaffe bomber crew operated as a team. Each member was mutually dependent on the others, and each had a vital part to play in ensuring that the aircraft reached its target, dropped its bombs, and safely returned back to base. The crew all shared the same experiences and dangers. The pilot of the bomber crew flew the aircraft throughout the operation and coordinated the actions of the other crew members. He was the captain of the aircraft, regardless of his rank, and he was the most important crew member. He was responsible for the lives of all the crew and the aircraft whilst in the air. If an emergency evacuation of the aircraft was necessary, the pilot had to stay at the controls and be the last to leave. The navigator was responsible for keeping the aircraft on course at all times, reaching the target and then the home base. He had to maintain a high level of concentration for virtually the whole of the flight, which could be up to 7 hours. The navigator was also responsible for aiming and releasing the bombs. He would lie flat in the nose of the aircraft, directing the pilot until the bombs were released and the bombing photograph was taken. This photograph was the proof that the operation had been completed, which meant that the crew could count it towards their total number of operations carried out. The bomb aimer could act as a reserve pilot in an emergency, as he would have received some flying training. The flight mechanic controlled the aircraft's mechanical, hydraulic, electrical, and fuel systems. He also assisted the pilot with takeoff and landing. In an emergency, the flight engineer would also be needed to give accurate fuel calculations. He was also a reserve bomb aimer and helped look out for enemy fighters. On the ground, he also liaised with the ground crew, who were responsible for servicing and maintaining the aircraft. The wireless operator transmitted all messages to and from the aircraft to the base. He had usually fewer duties than the other crew members, as operations were generally conducted in silence. However, he also served as the reserve gunner and addressed any minor emergencies at any part of the aircraft. If the aircraft got into difficulties, he had to send out positional signals. In the aircraft had to ditch into the sea, he had to remain at his post to send out a distress signal to improve the crew's chance of being located and rescued. The everyday lives of most aircrew, unlike other servicemen, were a unique mixture of danger and normality. At one moment, the men were on a bombing raid. A few hours later, they were safely at home in the bar. Bomber operations were extremely stressful and frequently dangerous, with a random chance of death or injury. Flying was physically and mentally demanding, and constant concentration was needed for many hours at a time. Airmen had to not only fight the enemy, but also a hostile environment in which they might encounter any kinds of adverse weather. Occupational hazards such as lack of oxygen, frostbite, and lower pressures at high altitude meant they needed equipment to keep them warm and breathing. These problems were increased by operating at night. On operations, most aircrew feared anti-aircraft fire, although statistically they were more likely to be shot down by fighters. Shrapnel from exploding flak could cause extensive damage not only to aircraft but also to the crew. It could result in serious injuries, especially if it struck the head or upper body. The sight and sound of shells bursting nearby were unnerving to an aircrew, and a near miss could cause the aircraft to jolt alarmingly. Fatigue and fear were the most common causes of combat stress for bomber crews. Several thousand Luftwaffe men suffered serious disorders, and an unknown, possibly much larger number experienced lesser symptoms. Simple treatments such as rest and relaxation were successful in many cases, and about a third of all casualties eventually returned to operations. For aircrew returning safely from the operation, relief at survival was the overriding emotion. Once home, they could enjoy a hot meal and a sleep in a warm bed. But not all aircrew made it home. If an aircraft flying over the sea was damaged or out of fuel, the crew would have to make an emergency landing on the water, known as ditching, which was always dangerous. If a good landing was made, the crew could escape into rubber dinghies. Men in the water did not stay alive for long. If survivors were spotted or their radio distress signals were heard, rescue could come in the form of a warship, fishing boat, or a seaplane. If an aircraft flying over land was critically damaged, aircrew would have to bail out. The parachutes were bulky and not completely reliable. Escape hatches were small and had to be located in the dark, and the aircraft might be on fire and out of control. Men were sometimes injured or killed by striking parts of the aircraft after jumping. The survivors would try to evade capture, as if they were not killed by angry civilians, they would become prisoners of war for the rest of the war. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support my channel, check out the PayPal donation link in the description or consider becoming a member. To make sure you don't miss my future work, subscribe to my channel please and press the bell notification button. Thank you and see you in the next video.